Okay, I'm going to get started on the special topics. And this is about separation of powers, which will be the main concept that you'll be wanting to think about as we go into the final exam. So I just want to start with the problem of powers so that you understand the background and how it became a policy within the United States. So you could go all the way back to the 1300s, but I think it's easier if you start in the 1500s with Henry VIII, who is the English king. And at that time, you had the king, the legislature, so very similar to Congress, and then you had landlords. The issue was that the King Henry used most of the money from the treasury or from taxes to essentially spend on parties and on his wives and on having a good time. This meant that he had to tax the landlords more, which at that time were called the barons, which meant that the landlords then had to work the tenants harder, meaning he had to raise their prices as well. The king also started wars in Europe, largely having to do with his marriages and then his desire to consolidate power in Europe. And this also required more work from the landlords and the tenants, including sending some of them out to be soldiers. He also then unites the church, which is the Church of England at this time, so separates from the Catholics, and then he unites that with the state, so you have no separation of church and state, you have them together, and he declares his right to be the divine king, in other words, that God had made him king. Now, at this time, Parliament starts to see that they can use legislation to limit the king's power. In other words, they notice that he's taking more and more power, and so they started to try to pass laws to limit his power. They limit how much money he could spend, how much taxes he could do, and they're going on kind of ongoing resistance to what the king is trying to do. But they were a little bit too late. They didn't get ahead of this, and so you start to see rebellions throughout the country. So this led to 200 years later, a French nobleman, a baron, de Montesquieu, he looked back and he studied constitutions in different countries. And he noticed that in England, that they were best able to keep social order or keep rebellions from happening when the powers were separated. So differently than what I just explained to you about King Henry. So what he noticed was that when one group of people try to take too much power, that creates inequity and then people rebel. So the argument here is trying to separate power from one group. So it's not about whether it's the judiciary or the Congress or the king. It's about one group should not have all of the power. So the more you can divide the power up, the less likely you're going to have rebellions. Now, he was worried about the English Constitution as well as the United States Constitution because those constitutions put an emphasis on liberty or freedom. And freedom tends to disunite people, and that tends to lead to an abuse of power. So he was not sure that you could have liberty and a separation of power at the same time. And he's largely been correct. So a lot of mistakes that students, and in fact a lot of professors make, is that this is not just about checks and balances. This is just not just about what the judiciary can do, what the executive can do, and what the legislature can do. In fact, most of the time, each of the departments of government are taking powers from the other. And so there's nothing you can really do to keep them from taking power, right? Power is one of those things like influence, resources, persuasiveness, right? There's all these things that are a part of power. You can't really do that by just quote unquote separating them. It reminds me a lot of if kids are fighting, you say, well, go to your separate corners. That doesn't mean that they won't be plotting their revenge in the corner. And so the major principle of trying to keep powers separate, again, is about groups. And that came from an ancient Roman philosopher, Polybius, that was studying constitutions of his time 2,000 years ago. And he noticed that all governments of any kind, doesn't matter if it's a monarchy, if it's a dictatorship, if it's a democracy, or a republic, they all go through growth, a peak, and then they begin to decay. And the decay is where you start to see rebellions. And decay is also where you see one or two groups try to take power over everything. And so what happens is that power gets concentrated in the hands of the wealthiest class, and then that creates problems further down the line because the lower classes suffer. And what he pointed out, which is still true today, is tax the rich is usually the slogan that comes right before massive rebellions. And so again, what you're separating are social groups. So you're making sure that the rich people don't take all of the influence. You have to be able to have as much participation as possible. Less participation, the more likely you're going to have rebellion. So why this matters is that if you look at the image to the right, you'll see not much changed from the feudal structure of the Middle Ages, with the exception that the lords, the barons, the elites, the wealthy, they replaced the king. So, but everything else more or less stayed the same. And so individual rights really only protect those at the top. If you believe you have individual rights at the bottom, they're only relevant to your social position. So you'd have individual rights as a tenant. You'd have individual rights as a worker, but you don't have the same individual rights as the president or as a CEO of a corporation. So those are different rights. You don't have them equally. And those at the top tend to abuse their power and cause the injustices of the people at the bottom. And so those at the bottom have to be aware that this is happening, and then they have to organize in order to resist those abuses of power. Now, if they're able to do that, then they tend to make pretty dramatic change. However, the Supreme Court tries to balance the system, so they try to keep it from changing. Their job is to make sure the system stays intact, not to help people at the bottom become more powerful. And so they won't really grant change unless it's a very small abuse of power. So if you think about it in criminal law, there's 13 exceptions to the warrant requirement in the Fourth Amendment. So that's 13 violations of your individual rights as a working class person. So they'll only give you reform if you can show a very egregious harm. So that tends to work against people at the bottom. And then finally, for using in this class and preparing for the final exam, you want to use the rights that you've learned about and then try to put them into three categories. How do they affect the institution, which are the organizations, the rules, the procedures, lawyers, politicians, judges, the rules of the game that kind of apply to that system, and then what does that say about authority, about who gets to be a decision maker. And so the injustice begins at the cops, right? Cops are the ones who respond to injustices. Then through the paperwork process, they go to the courts, and then they're supposed to be resolving that conflict. And then finally, after the courts have had their say, then it goes off to the correction system, and now we're dealing with punishment. Now, the next category over would be the instrumentalities or the tools. And so you want to think about what are the tools available within whatever institution you're in. So cops have particular tools, courts have particular tools, and corrections officers have particular tools. And then you want to watch the methods that these actors within this organization play. So police officers follow their protocols and their training, right? Courts go to law, judges in courts go to law school, lawyers go to law school, so they use particular methods. Corrections officers go to a different type of school, they use particular methods. The rules are all different in each of those groups, and then there's a process where you're going to resolve the issue or you're going to have a final judgment. This works out, right? At the cops level, you think about your individual rights as the Bill of Rights, okay? But this is really to protect individuals against federal infractions, not so much state infractions. So cops have the benefit of the doubt in that situation. The 14th Amendment applies at the court level, and that's more about due process. So is the process correct, right? It's not whether it was fair, it's whether did they follow the rules of the court process. And then for corrections, you of course know there's the appeals and the reentry programs, parole, probation, things like that. Finally, probably most importantly, there's ideologies, and these are the mental models or the way that people think when they have contacts with one another. And so these are ideas that people share as they kind of go through these situations together. So there'd be no police officers without the label criminals, right? There'd be no judges without lawyers, right? And so all these people have ideas that they share and beliefs about those rules of the game. And these tend to be into three categories or three terms: individual responsibility, individual liberty, and individual rights. And so as you see, however society through the legislatures label deviance or crime, that's how police officers are going to respond. And then Bill of Rights is only going to respond to that situation. However society defines fairness, or what they think in this country is the adversarial system, so prosecutor, criminal defender, right? They come in, and so if the process is fair, if it's due, then they say the conflict is resolved. Doesn't really matter if it was a wrongful conviction, right? It was just the process was followed. And then finally, we think about corrections as a debt to society, and so you pay your debt to society. It's not really about reforming or helping you get a job, right? It's just about paying off your debt. And so that influences the system. Most important thing to know is that each of these things work to reinforce the other, so you can't separate them. Institution, instrumentalities, and ideologies all go together. And if you change the way society labels crime, then the rest of the system will also change. So if you wanted to make a big social change, defining crime would be the place you'd want to start, not at other ends of the system. And then try to remember that all the actors within the system are constituted as legal identities. So politicians, are defined in the Constitution. Business people are defined in the Constitution. Workers are defined in labor law. Criminals are defined by criminal law. Officers of the court, right? Police officers, those are all defined by state law. And you could keep going on and on and on. People are defined using the legal identities. And so this is a way that you want to try to think about separation of powers. Is the separation is not about the branches of government, because as you see, they all overlap. The separation is between rich, poor, workers, landowners. The more power gets into one hands of one group, the more likely you're going to have a rebellion.